All right, so I passed this little chart around in class, and it's just based on Jonathan Glover's essay. It makes no difference whether or not I do it, which is on Blackboard if you feel like reading it, but I figure, it's, you know, probably a lot of the people don't have a ton of time to just read these random philosophical essays that I post up there, so, I made this nifty little chart and passed around, and, might give us a context for looking at the conversation we've been having about, whether you would take the $2,000 to line up behind the firing squad and fire the 3 shots, after they've begun firing at the condemned person. So yeah, he's interested in this problem because it's legitimately difficult for consequentialists to argue against these arguments, because if your entire moral philosophy is based on the consequence of actions, then these present a real barrier, when people argue, well, it doesn't make any difference whether or not I do this thing, even though it would normally be considered wrong. So he's saying, this isn't really a single philosophical argument so much as a family of arguments. So he kind of breaks it down, as you can see, into insignificant difference and no difference. And now some of these insignificant difference arguments are just context illusions. So, and these are my examples, not his. But if he adopting a puppy, adopting a kid, if they're not going to have as good of a life if you don't take them in, feeding someone who's hungry, for example, saving an animal who's otherwise going to die. These are all concretely good things. These are doing objective good. It's only when you look at it's only if you let yourself get kind of morally paralyzed by the larger context of a very big problem that you can't solve that it seems like it's only like it makes no difference. So he kind of brushes that aside pretty early, and then he gets into these real insignificant difference arguments, which he breaks into 2 situations: absolute thresholds and discrimination thresholds. The absolute threshold being something like voting, where there's a very specific number of votes you need for something very specific and obvious to happen. If Richard Spencer's running for president, a certain number of people need to vote against him for, him to lose. And so, if he needed 100 more and you're one of those people who didn't vote, if you needed 100 more to lose and you didn't vote, then, you can consider yourself having shared in that culpability for Richard Spencer now being president of the United States. And the discrimination threshold would be something more like running your heater during the electricity shortage, right? So he said his argument is basically, in these situations, it's perfectly reasonable to apply a divisibility principle. If you and 100 other people need to act a certain way for something bad to happen, you can consider yourself holding 1/100th of the moral culpability for that thing happening. So this argument from insignificant difference would work either if the increments don't add up to discernible harm, or if there's countervailing good that outweighs the harm of those various increments, one of which you contributed. So that takes us to really the meat of his argument, these no difference arguments. And the classic example he's using, one that comes up a lot, is taking a job helping the government build chemical weapons or biological weapons, if we're operating under the assumption that doing so is wrong. Because you would argue, well, it'd be great if our government wasn't doing this, but if I don't take this job, some other scientist will. So he goes over some arguments that he thinks are good rebuttals to this and some bad ones. The less effective arguments are just the basic argument from justice that I have a duty to participate in social practices from which I benefit, even if the threshold would be reached without me, which, if you think about it, isn't super tenable, because that would obligate you to participate in a lot of different things, even benefits you didn't necessarily ask for. And then there's the absolute prohibitions argument that we should just say certain things are wrong no matter what. just one should never do this, one should never do that, regardless of what the consequences of this or that type of thing are. Which he considers that kind of a morally compromised position, because how would you ever decide what acts to prohibit absolutely without some reference to the consequences or the outcomes of those acts? So you can't really carry this out without recourse to the very principle it's claiming to eschew. Right. So then there's the Solzhenitsyn principle he brings up, which is basically the principle that let a lie come into the world, or let evil come into the world, but do not let it come through me. Which is kind of an interesting third way between strict consequentialism and absolute prohibitions, because it's not demanding that we ban certain acts or certain activities no matter what the context, but it's also not, strict consequentialism either. And this is sort of similar to, it's getting us into the same territory we get into the, territory that Bernard Williams gets into in his parable, where you have the option of shooting one of the 20 Indians, and if you shoot one of the 20, the other 19 go free. But if you don't agree to shoot one, all 20 will get shot, which is, Bernard Williams is kind of making the opposite argument, but I think Glover is pointing out that that is one of the criticisms of the Solzhenitsyn principle, is that in certain situations like that, it might entail keeping our hands clean at a cost paid by other people. The other problems with the Solzhenitsyn principle is, as in that situation, it presupposes a difference between acts and omissions that most people probably wouldn't accept without a kind of argument for them. But there's also the question is, when and how do you decide to take these moral feelings seriously? Like, for example, I might feel moral disgust at vivisection, but when I think about the people that might be helped and the disease that might be prevented, I might decide to overrule that revulsion. So it's, again, when do you decide that these feelings have moral import? When do you decide they have moral import that you should take seriously? So that's kind of all the arguments against the it makes no difference argument that he doesn't consider effective rebuttals. But what he does consider a fairly strong response is these side effect arguments. So if you're the scientist and you don't take the chemical weapons job out of principle, and you talk to other scientists about why you didn't, and it's well known why you didn't, that can have an effect on how other scientists look at that kind of job. That can have an impact on the culture. And some side effects qualify as what you call spiral effects, which they influence people, which will act in ways that influence more people. So there's kind of a multiplier effect of you turning down the job. So going back to voting, if you believe there's like a third party or a lesser known candidate that, strictly speaking, doesn't stand a chance, there's still an argument for supporting them, because the more support they get, the more people will know about them, and there's sort of a multiplication effect of every new donor, every new person who pays attention to them, of anything that gets them any more news coverage or visibility. Of course, these side effect or spiral effect arguments, he would argue, they do often take us back to these discrimination thresholds, which would require applying the divisibility principle. But he still thinks those are the strongest case to be made. He thinks those can be the most effective rebuttals against the it makes no difference arguments. And if we think about how this applies to our scenario we were talking about in class with the, do you fire the pistol shots at the guy who's basically already going to be dead by the time the shots hit him, if they manage to hit him. I can't know this, but I have a feeling Glover would probably make that kind of an argument, that he would probably try to argue that, okay, if I refuse to do this on principle, if I refuse to take part in this execution, if this is a world where no one questions these executions, or no one questions this person's guilt, or this method of execution, this might get other people thinking. If there's already sort of movement against this kind of thing and being asked to participate in, this might contribute to this movement. This might empower that movement. I'm guessing that's where he'd go with it. But yeah, it was a fun discussion.